In the heart of Memphis, Tennessee, a city brimming with history, soul, and power, there exists a dark story, a tale so twisted it seems almost unreal. It's a story about a family whose name once commanded respect and fear. A story of a 65-year-old former gang leader, a man who built an empire, only to watch it crumble at his own hands. But the true horror of this tale begins with a simple question. What would drive a father to murder his own son? This is the story of Victor Harrison, a former gang lord turned real estate mogul, a man whose wealth and power were unmatched. He wasn't just a businessman. No, Victor Harrison was a feared name, a shadow that loomed over Memphis, a man who'd survived every fight and built his empire on ruthless ambition. But behind the facade of success, something darker festered, a secret that would tear his entire world apart. Then there's Lucas, his only son, a man caught in the weight of his father's legacy, desperate to prove himself, but burdened by the impossible standards set by Victor. At 30 years old, Lucas had carved his own path, working as a successful music executive in Memphis's vibrant, booming music scene. Yet, no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, it was never enough for Victor. The father and son grew more distant, the cracks widening until they couldn't be ignored. And then there was Sophie Grant. Beautiful, manipulative, and utterly charming. A 24-year-old actress with dreams of fame, but her ambitions weren't just about stardom. No, Sophie had far grander plans. When she stepped into the lives of Victor and Lucas, she saw something more than just a wealthy family. She saw power. She saw a way to secure her own future. And, most dangerously of all, she knew how to play the game. Sophie wasn't just interested in Lucas's affection. She wanted to control both father and son. With a whisper here, a glance there, Sophie weaved her web of deceit. She told Lucas everything he wanted to hear, convincing him that his father was plotting to take everything from him, that Victor saw him not as an heir, but as a threat. But that wasn't the whole story. Sophie turned to Victor, feeding his paranoia, making him believe his son was conspiring to destroy the empire he'd spent his entire life building. She played them both like puppets in a cruel game. Victor, once a feared gang lord, was no fool. But when his paranoia took hold, he began seeing threats everywhere, especially from the one person he trusted most, his own son. As the days passed, the tension in the Harrison family grew unbearable. The lies Sophie had planted began to take root, and the rift between father and son became more dangerous by the day. Everything came to a head at the Empire Club Gala, Memphis's most exclusive gathering, a night where the city's wealthiest came to show off, to network, to gain power. But on this night, Victor and Lucas's strained relationship boiled over. In front of their peers, their dirty laundry was aired for all to see. And in that moment, everything they had built seemed to crumble into nothing. What had once been a father's pride now turned into a battleground. But the night was far from over. Later that evening, Lucas received a message from Sophie. A simple text, "Meet me at the pool house." What he didn't know was that Sophie had set the stage for something much darker. What seemed like an innocent rendezvous would soon turn into the deadly confrontation that would end everything. Victor arrived at the pool house, consumed by fear and paranoia. His mind clouded by Sophie's lies, he saw Lucas as a threat, his own flesh and blood. The conversation that followed was one of confusion, anger, and desperation. Words were exchanged, accusations hurled, and then, in a flash, the unthinkable happened. In the heat of the moment, Victor pulled the trigger, his own son, lying lifeless at his feet. And Sophie, standing in the shadows, watched coldly as Lucas fell to the ground. She had orchestrated it all. The perfect crime. The perfect lie. As she picked up the phone to call 911, her only thought was how her plan had worked, how she had torn a family apart and gotten exactly what she wanted. This was the moment everything changed. A father, a son, and a woman who destroyed them both. What was once an empire was now a shattered legacy. Before we continue, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our gripping true crime stories. Memphis, Tennessee, home to the rhythm of the blues, the pulse of the music industry, and a city where wealth and power often hide behind closed doors. It's a place where people rise and fall, and legends are made. But within the city's shiny facade lies a darker undercurrent, a world where corruption runs deep, and crime is sometimes just business as usual. And at the center of it all stood one name, Harrison. The Harrison family's empire, built on blood, sweat, and ruthless ambition. Victor Harrison, the patriarch, had spent decades constructing his wealth, emerging from the gritty streets of Memphis as a feared and respected gang leader. His transformation was nothing short of remarkable. From underworld deals to towering skyscrapers, Victor had ascended. And now, at 65 years old, he was the king of a vast real estate empire, controlling everything from luxury apartments to high-end nightclubs in the city. To the public, he was untouchable, a man who commanded respect from the city's elite. But what people didn't see was the price Victor had paid to build his legacy and the toll it had taken on his family. Victor's story wasn't always about power and control. In his younger years, he was a man consumed by ambition, a man who had seen the darkest corners of life and came out stronger. But as the years went by, something changed. A tragedy struck, a blow that no amount of wealth or power could undo. The death of his wife, the woman who had been by his side through it all, left a void in Victor's life that he could never fill. And with that, the cracks in his emotional armor began to appear. His son, Lucas, the heir to the Harrison fortune, had always been his pride. But what had once been a close bond was now a distant, fractured relationship. Lucas Harrison, 30 years old, a man who had spent his life trying to escape the shadows of his father's past. He wasn't like Victor, and he didn't want to be. While his father had built an empire through intimidation and ruthlessness, Lucas sought to forge his own path. He had carved out a name for himself as a successful music executive in Memphis's vibrant entertainment industry, working with top artists and planning high-profile events. His success in the music world was undeniable. But no matter what Lucas achieved, no matter how many accolades or business ventures he undertook, it was never enough for Victor. The approval he so desperately sought from his father remained just out of reach. As Lucas rose through the ranks of Memphis's elite, the gap between father and son grew wider. Lucas longed for Victor's approval, but it seemed as if nothing he did could fill the emotional void. And the more Lucas tried to step out of his father's shadow, the more Victor distanced himself. The tension between them reached a boiling point, an unspoken divide that both men felt but never addressed. Victor, burdened by his past, had closed himself off emotionally, too lost in the pursuit of his empire to realize the damage being done to his family. Lucas, on the other hand, became increasingly frustrated and resentful of the coldness he faced from the one person who should have supported him the most. Victor's empire, built on decades of blood and sweat, had left him isolated. His business world was thriving, but his family life was withering. Lucas was ready to take over, but he couldn't break free from the shadow of the empire his father had created. Father and son, once close, now distant, caught in a toxic cycle of unspoken expectations and unmet desires. What was supposed to be a legacy of power was now on the verge of falling apart. The cracks in their relationship were about to widen into a chasm that would swallow everything they had built. But little did they know, it wasn't just their fractured relationship that was going to bring the empire down. There was someone else, someone waiting to destroy everything from within. A woman who saw nothing but opportunity and knew exactly how to play the game. Her name was Sophie Grant, and she would change the course of their lives forever. Lucas Harrison, 30 years old, had spent the better part of his life trying to break free from the suffocating shadow of his father. Raised in the bustling world of the Harrison Empire, Lucas had always felt the weight of legacy pressing down on him. His father, Victor, a man who had conquered the city with a ruthless drive for power, had always expected the same from his son. But Lucas wasn't like Victor. He didn't want to be. While his father had built his empire through intimidation and ruthless business tactics, Lucas sought a different kind of success, one that was about creativity, influence, and innovation. He immersed himself in Memphis's thriving music industry, carving out a name for himself as a music executive, managing the careers of some of the city's top rising stars. Lucas had achieved what most people only dream of: a successful career, wealth, and respect in his own right. But despite all of that, a gnawing emptiness lingered. Deep down, Lucas always felt like he was just an extension of Victor's empire, a mere heir to his father's throne, not the man who would ever create his own legacy. For years, he sought the one thing he craved most: his father's approval. But no matter how hard he tried, it was always just out of reach. No matter the accomplishments, the accolades, the ventures Lucas built, they always paled in comparison to the towering figure of Victor. The bond that should have connected them was unraveling, slowly but surely. To the world, Lucas Harrison seemed to have it all: wealth, success, the glamorous lifestyle. He was rubbing elbows with the biggest names in Memphis's music scene, attending parties where everyone knew his name. But those who saw him behind closed doors knew something different. He wasn't happy. He wasn't at peace. For all the glittering success that came with his career, Lucas had no idea where he truly belonged. The Harrison Empire had been built on the foundation of Victor's dominance, and Lucas had never truly been able to escape it. As he worked tirelessly in the spotlight, Lucas began to wonder, was he destined to live in his father's shadow forever? Was there any way to ever break free? As the emotional gap between them widened, Lucas began to question everything he had worked for. Was this the life he had envisioned for himself? Or was he merely playing a role in his father's world? It was in this fractured state of mind that fate intervened, and it came in the form of a woman, one who would disrupt everything Lucas thought he knew about loyalty, love, and trust. Enter Sophie Grant, a 24-year-old aspiring actress and socialite with ambitions far greater than what her small-town roots could offer. Sophie had grown up learning how to use her beauty to manipulate those around her. She was a woman who knew what she wanted, and she knew how to get it. Ambitious, confident, and calculating, Sophie had one goal in mind: to ascend the social ladder of Memphis's elite. And to do that, she needed power. And that power was contained within two men, Victor and Lucas Harrison. Sophie had studied them both, the father and the son, and she understood exactly how to play them. With Lucas, she saw a young man full of potential, but deeply insecure, desperate for approval. She fed him the validation he craved, and in return, he opened up to her. He revealed his frustrations about his father, the pain he carried from years of emotional neglect. Sophie listened, whispered the words Lucas needed to hear, and began to plant the seeds of doubt. To Lucas, Sophie seemed like a confidant, a woman who understood the complexities of his strained relationship with his father. She told him what he wanted to hear: that his father was plotting to replace him, that Victor was preparing to steal the very empire Lucas had fought so hard to be a part of. Sophie fed Lucas's fears and insecurities like a silent poison, turning his admiration for Victor into resentment and mistrust. And with Victor, Sophie played a different game. She whispered into his ear that Lucas had become a rival, plotting to steal the empire that Victor had worked so hard to build. She twisted the truth, feeding his growing paranoia, making him believe that his own flesh and blood had become a threat. Sophie knew how to manipulate their fears, how to turn them against each other. And with each word she spoke, she pulled the strings tighter. Sophie had become the puppet master, and Victor and Lucas were her unwitting puppets. She had placed them in opposition, driving a wedge between father and son. The stage was set, and now, all she had to do was wait for the inevitable collision. While you are enjoying this interesting story, please subscribe to the channel. Sophie Grant, at 24, knew exactly how to make her presence felt. A woman with ambitions far larger than the small town she had come from, Sophie wasn't just looking for fame. She was playing a much deeper game. The glitzy nightlife, the high-profile gatherings, these were her arenas. And in these spaces, she wasn't just a pretty face. She was a strategist, using her charm to maneuver her way into the circles of power. But Sophie wasn't interested in fame alone. No, her real target was something much more valuable: the Harrison family fortune. When Sophie first laid eyes on Lucas Harrison, she saw opportunity. She knew who he was, what he represented: the heir to one of Memphis's most powerful dynasties. But Sophie's interest in Lucas wasn't as simple as romance. She had done her homework. She knew the tension that simmered between father and son. She knew that Lucas was hungry for approval, but just as desperate to prove that he wasn't just the heir to his father's empire. He wanted to build something of his own, something that didn't feel like a shadow of Victor's brutal legacy. Sophie wasted no time. She began weaving a narrative, one that echoed Lucas's deepest insecurities. She told him what he wanted to hear: that his father, the man he had spent his life trying to impress, was planning to push him out of the family business. Sophie fed Lucas's fears, stoking the fire of resentment that had been building for years. She whispered about how Victor had already chosen his successor, how Lucas was nothing more than an afterthought in his father's plans. Sophie's words were poison, calculated, precise, and devastating. She turned Lucas's perception of his father into one of betrayal. She made him believe that Victor wasn't just a distant father. He was a man plotting against him, someone who wanted to take everything away. Lucas, desperate for something to explain the pain he had felt for so long, began to buy into Sophie's lies. What Sophie didn't know was that she was feeding Lucas exactly what he had been searching for his entire life: validation for his bitterness. But Sophie didn't stop with Lucas. No, she was much more strategic than that. The real danger in her plan lay in her ability to manipulate both sides. She knew exactly how to play on Victor's ego, to make him feel as though everything he had built, his legacy, was under threat. Sophie approached Victor with the same stories. Only this time she turned the tables. She told him that Lucas had become disillusioned, that he was plotting to undermine him, to take the empire Victor had fought so hard to create. She told him Lucas was building a secret plan, a way to steal everything he'd worked for. Sophie twisted the truth so expertly, playing on Victor's insecurities about his age, his legacy, and his place in the world. She planted seeds of doubt, making Victor see Lucas not as his son, but as a rival, a threat to the empire he had spent decades building. Sophie didn't just tell him stories. She convinced him. She made him believe that his own flesh and blood was plotting against him. As Victor's paranoia grew, so did the tension between father and son. As the days passed, the rift between Victor and Lucas deepened, fueled by Sophie's manipulation. What had once been a distant but manageable tension became something darker, something dangerous. Victor's once unwavering confidence began to crack under the pressure, and Lucas's feelings of betrayal and resentment only grew stronger. Sophie had turned them both into pawns in her game, manipulating each of them against the other, playing their deepest fears like a master musician playing a delicate instrument. Sophie watched from the sidelines, a cold smile on her face as she watched her plan unfold. She knew exactly what she had done. The game was no longer about Lucas or Victor. It was about control. And now, Sophie held the reins. Victor had once been the most feared man in Memphis, a king who commanded the loyalty of his people. But now, the walls he had built to protect his empire were closing in. He no longer saw his son as the heir he had always wanted. No, Lucas was the enemy. And that, Sophie knew, was the point of no return. She had successfully turned father against son, and now there was no going back. The Empire Club Gala, an annual spectacle reserved for Memphis's most powerful and influential. The elite gathered here not just to celebrate wealth and culture, but to display their dominance, reaffirm alliances, and, in hushed corners, exchange secrets. On this night, the Harrison name was once again on everyone's lips, but not for the reasons Victor hoped. This night was supposed to be one of unity, an image of power, a statement to the city that the Harrisons were as solid as ever. But beneath the polished surface, the cracks were deepening. Sophie had done her work well, planting seeds of suspicion and paranoia, igniting emotional fires that neither father nor son could contain. All that was left was the spark. Lucas had heard enough whispers, enough warnings, enough rumors. Fueled by months of quiet resentment, by Sophie's manipulations, and by his own aching need for acknowledgement, Lucas walked across the ballroom floor toward his father. And what began as a private confrontation quickly spiraled into a public unraveling. Lucas asked, "What do you want from me, Dad? I've worked my whole life for this family. I've sacrificed. I've done everything you asked, everything. And it's still not enough." Victor replied, "You want a crown you haven't earned. You think shaking hands with a few celebrities makes you a king? You don't even know what this empire cost me." In front of Memphis's power brokers, the facade of the Harrison dynasty shattered. The air was thick with the weight of decades of silence and suppressed emotion. Lucas wasn't just speaking for himself. He was releasing years of rejection, of trying to become more than just Victor's heir. And Victor, unable to understand his son's pain, saw only rebellion, betrayal, a threat to his rule. Victor said, "You've done nothing but ride my coattails, Lucas. Don't mistake the life I gave you for something you built." Lucas replied, "And you never gave me anything I didn't have to beg for." It was a spectacle, a family legacy unraveling in real time. The glimmer of the chandeliers couldn't disguise the darkness taking root. As father and son stood there, locked in a war of words, the people around them, colleagues, enemies, socialites, watched as the once mighty Harrison family crumbled under the weight of its own pride. And in the shadows, Sophie smiled. She had done what no rival, no competitor, no street gang or business tycoon had ever managed. She had driven a wedge between Victor and Lucas that no apology, no truth, no reconciliation could ever repair. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. While you are enjoying this interesting story, please subscribe to the channel. After the gala, the city settled into its midnight hush, but peace would not return to the Harrison estate. That night, while the elite of Memphis returned to their penthouses and power meetings, a text message quietly sealed the fate of a family. Lucas had no reason to doubt her. Sophie had become the one person he trusted when everything else seemed to be crumbling. In his eyes, she was the only one who understood him, the only one who believed in him. What he didn't realize was that the pool house wasn't just a meeting place. It was the stage for his final act. As Lucas approached the pool house, the weight of the night still hung on his shoulders. Maybe he wanted a vent. Maybe he hoped Sophie could help him make sense of the chaos. Maybe, deep down, he just didn't want to feel alone anymore. But what he didn't know was that he had already been marked. Sophie wasn't waiting to console him. She was waiting to deliver the final blow in a story she had spent months scripting. She had told Victor that Lucas planned to attack him, to overthrow him. She had whispered just enough truth to make the lies believable. She had even staged bruises on her arms, claiming Lucas had grown violent. It wasn't just manipulation, it was psychological warfare. and both men were already at war with ghosts she created. Victor Harrison, once Memphis's most composed and dangerous kingpin, was no longer in control. Not of his business, not of his family, not even of his mind. Fear, pride, betrayal, they had all fermented into something far more lethal. Rage. Lucas asked, "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" Victor said, "You've been lying to me, plotting behind my back. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away." Lucas replied, "Wait, what? Are you serious? I don't even know what she told you, but this isn't it. I swear to you." But by then, logic was no longer part of the conversation. The room was thick with mistrust. Every word Lucas spoke was filtered through the poison Sophie had been dripping into Victor's ears for weeks. To Victor, this wasn't his son standing in front of him. It was a threat. In one moment, years of legacy, of pain, of hope, were reduced to silence. Lucas Harrison fell to the floor, his life taken by the very man he had spent his whole life trying to please. Sophie speaking on phone. "There's been a shooting. I think he's dead. Please hurry." She played her part flawlessly. The tearful caller, the accidental witness, the innocent caught in a family's implosion. But in reality, Sophie was the architect. She had orchestrated every step, pushed every button, pulled every string. And now, as sirens screamed in the distance, her masterpiece was complete. The city would wake to headlines of tragedy, of power gone wrong, of a dynasty undone. But no one, not even Victor, truly knew how deep the manipulation had gone, or just how far Sophie was willing to go to ensure she came out on top. As the sun rose over Memphis, so did the headlines. The Harrison name, once synonymous with power, influence, and legacy, was now splashed across news tickers and morning talk shows in a very different context. Local mogul shoots son in tragic confrontation. It was the kind of story made for the tabloids, but behind the sensational headlines, something didn't sit right. Not for Detective Elizabeth Carter. Detective Carter had spent over 2 decades with the Memphis Police Department. She was respected, meticulous, and most of all, intuitive. And from the moment she walked onto the Harrison estate, her instincts began whispering. Something was off. The story presented to her was too clean, too scripted. Sophie Grant, who claimed she had been an innocent bystander, was composed, even convincing. But Liz had seen too many lies delivered with tears to be swayed by good acting. Sophie claimed she had tried to mediate between father and son, that she had begged Lucas to calm down, that Victor had acted in a fit of rage. It all sounded plausible, until you listened to the pauses, the timing, the way her story stayed too polished across every retelling. It wasn't just what Sophie said, it was what she didn't say. There were no inconsistencies, no gaps, and that, in itself, was suspicious. The deeper Liz dug, the more cracks appeared. Sophie's carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. Digital footprints revealed that her text to Lucas had been sent less than 10 minutes after a flurry of messages to Victor. Messages that suggested not fear, but planning. Sophie hadn't just been present. She had been preparing them both, feeding fuel to the fire until it became an inferno. And then came the name that shifted the entire case: Julian Moretti, a Memphis businessman with a long-standing vendetta against Victor Harrison, a man who had once tried and failed to seize control of Victor's real estate holdings, whose shady dealings had landed him in hot water with the very empire Victor built. Liz found that Sophie wasn't just connected to Moretti. She was financially supported by him. Wire transfers, private meetings, secretive communications. Suddenly, this wasn't just a family tragedy. It was an orchestrated collapse. Sophie hadn't just manipulated a father and son into turning on each other. She had been the tool of revenge, the pawn, or perhaps the queen, in a long game played by Julian Moretti. She embedded herself into the Harrison family, studied their weaknesses, and pulled each string with chilling precision. What began as a love triangle had become something much darker, a calculated takedown of an empire from the inside out. For Detective Liz Carter, justice was never just about arresting the guilty. It was about uncovering truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. And as she stared down at the city below, she knew the truth had finally come to light. But not before it had claimed a son, destroyed a father, and exposed the chilling power of a woman who knew exactly how to break them both. In a courtroom filled with the echoes of fallen power, Victor Harrison stood to face the consequences of his actions. A man who once ruled Memphis from boardrooms and back alleys now bowed his head and pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter. The sentence, 20 years. 20 years to sit in silence, haunted by the image of his son collapsing before him. A life taken not by an enemy, but by his own hand. Sophie Grant was convicted for her role in orchestrating the deadly chain of events. But she showed no sorrow, no apologies. For her, the end was the goal. And she got it. She dismantled an empire from within, a puppet master cloaked in innocence, who left ruin in her wake. For Detective Liz Carter, the case left a lasting scar. It was a stark reminder that beneath power, beneath privilege, lie vulnerabilities that could be weaponized. Greed, ego, ambition, when mixed with manipulation, can destroy not just reputations, but lives. The Harrison legacy was gone, reduced to headlines and prison records, and those who remained were left only with the wreckage. Thank you for joining us in tonight's chilling journey through power, betrayal, and loss. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with those who appreciate the darkest corners of truth. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't strangers, they're the ones closest to home. Stay tuned for more real-life tales from the world of true crime.